From the European SharePoint Conference 2015 in Stockholm, my next guest is?
Tobias Zimmergren.
And you're from?
I'm from Sweden.
Yeah, it's a home game.
I'm from here, yeah.
And you're working for which company?
A company called Rencore, where we do SharePoint code analysis and make sure that the code that you deploy to SharePoint is actually of accurate quality.
Yeah, and we want to little talk about coding, about developing. What's a good developing strategy now for Office 365 and SharePoint?
So if you talk Office 365 and SharePoint in general and moving forward, I'd say that there's been a huge shift in how you develop and how you used to develop. Because back in the day, in SharePoint 2007, 2010, and even in 2013, you do development for farm solutions of your on-prem environment, and it's not decoupled from SharePoint, it's actually inside of SharePoint. The shift we're seeing and have been seeing now for the last couple of years is we're actually moving away from building stuff inside of SharePoint. We're building it as our own services or our own applications, and then we just use the APIs to connect to SharePoint. And from a developer point of view, this is what I've been missing for a long time, because now we can use normal web development techniques and connect to SharePoint and make that part of our SharePoint environment in Office 365 or on premises, but we can still have it fully decoupled. And that also means that if I make a bad solution, or if I make a mistake in my code, or if we have a service interruption or service window or something like that, that only affects my own application. It doesn't actually affect SharePoint. So the way that Microsoft is moving is they're decoupling everything by providing us with unified APIs for Office 365 and different APIs for client object models and so on. And by doing that, it allows us to create these separate units of applications and then just communicate between your application and SharePoint rather than actually changing SharePoint.
Does it make any difference if you develop for on-premise or for the cloud, or is it the same?
It's not exactly the same, because the Office 365 APIs, like the unified APIs, that is for Office 365 in the cloud. But if you want to use client-side object model for the on-prem versions of SharePoint 2013 or even SharePoint 2010, they created the CSOM, or client-side object model, which is a .NET-based object model you can use in your on-prem environment. And for 2013, they've enhanced that a bit, and the REST APIs also work in SharePoint 2013. But in all honesty, the speed or the release cadence that they release new APIs and features in the cloud is ridiculously amazing. So we're seeing an entirely new Microsoft. Actually, the release cadence is so impressive that it could be a hard time even keeping up with new features coming out in the APIs. But most of the times when they make a change in the API, it doesn't actually break anything. They add features. And if there is a breaking change, normally that happens if you're in a beta or a preview.
Here's the conference. I'm going to several partners, and they are offering now apps for SharePoint. So the app model is there for, I think, some years, and the App Store is there, but it's not very popular. But seeing more and more solutions coming up, is the App Store a way to go for the future for developers to develop apps?
It's a good question, and I think there's no clear answer to that before we have numbers of how many customers are actually using apps, like in Office 365 and in SharePoint in general. The way we do it and the way that Microsoft is recently doing it with the Office 365 patterns and practices and the recommendations coming out is that you build separate solutions. You don't have to deploy them as apps inside of your SharePoint. You can actually keep them outside of the store if you want, and then just give the users or the customers a way to log into your app and integrate that, and even use their own context tokens to authenticate as their own user. So you don't actually have to use the app model, as it's called. You can actually just build a web application, use REST APIs to connect back and forth to your own application in SharePoint. So I don't have a lot of experience with success in the App Store or in the Microsoft Store, because a lot of the people that I know in my community, in my vicinity that has been using it, they're not really seeing the traction that they expected when they launched an app.
Sometimes I think it's a hen-egg problem. People go into the store, say, oh, there are no interesting apps there.
There's too few apps, so I don't go in there.
And partners saying, oh, nobody's coming to the store. So I think somebody has to create some cool apps and get it more propagated.
Yeah, maybe it'll grow that way. But for us, and the way I develop my stuff now for Rencore, and the way that my customers have been doing it in the past at least 2 or 3 years, is you create decoupled units of applications and you provide your customers with either a separate login portal for your own application, or you integrate it into SharePoint so they can use OAuth or some kind of authentication going back and forth between your application and SharePoint. But it doesn't have to go through the App Store. For some customers, that's a requirement to go through the App Store, but for most people that I've been working with, it doesn't really matter as long as you provide a good service and it's seamless for the user. So you have some kind of single sign-on experience for the user, so they don't have to re-enter the passwords going to your application and so on. And you can achieve that even outside of the App Store as well.
Yeah, I'm not a developer, but when I think back to 2 or 5 or 6 years, everybody said we are programming SharePoint with C#. But when I now read articles, I think there are frameworks, there's Angular, Node. I have no idea what it is, but it seems very popular. Can you give us a little overview? What's that?
Yeah, so the first point there is there's so many frameworks that if you're going to learn them all, your head will basically explode. There is so much information and what
is the advantage of such a framework?
Well, there's different advantages of different frameworks. You have Node.js, you have Angular, you have Knockout, you have React. There's a really big amount of frameworks growing, especially on the client side and JavaScript frameworks. And some people argue that Angular is the only way to go. Some people argue that Knockout is the best way to go. But that's not really the question you should be asking yourself, or put your foot down and say that this is my favorite framework. You should rather realize what the actual requirements for the application are and then choose the framework based on that. Because it doesn't really matter which front-end framework you choose today, because the Office 365 APIs are REST-based. So you can call them from any framework using JavaScript or even .NET code, using PHP if you want. So the framework, I would say, is something that you should try and fit into your application based on the requirement rather than it's my favorite framework. And obviously the experience in the team as well. If everyone is experienced using Angular, maybe you're more productive in using that than building something new on a new framework. But I'd say that the most important question is not which framework should I use because I love the framework, but rather what framework should I use because the application requires it.
So, and the framework provides me with out-of-the-box functions that I don't have to reprogram, but I can use for my applications.
Yeah, a lot of the framework come with different benefits, and if you just go to Angular.js, for example, you have all the data binding and stuff that people are finding really useful, and the same with Knockout, which is, in my opinion, a bit simpler framework, but it does the job really well. If you just want data binding and finding information in your queries and binding that to HTML and do that in a really nice way. So I wouldn't promote one framework over the other. I would say that they're all good in their own way, and you have to find your requirements and match that with your framework. But you should know that the Office 365 APIs, you can call them using any framework, any language. They're just URL endpoints, essentially. And since any framework, which is a client dev framework, can connect to any URL, you can make REST queries through Angular, through Node.js, through whatever you want. So it shouldn't be a problem in choosing frameworks based on the Office 365 requirements. It should rather be choose the framework that works best for you in your project.
So when you start a new project today, are you thinking the cloud-first, mobile-first strategy? So if you're starting a program, say, hey, it should be mobile and it should be running in the cloud?
Yeah, so this is obviously the vision from Microsoft to go mobile first and cloud first. And the way I develop my stuff is that we want to make it available. We want to make it available for everyone using the app, whether you're on mobile, whether you're on on-prem environment or wherever you're coming in from. So I think that's important, of course, to have that in mind as well. But when you start a new project, by doing web development. Back in the day, you started a new SharePoint project. Like if you went into Visual Studio, you took new SharePoint project, empty solution, or a WebPad solution, or Visual WebPad solution, or something like that. But you don't have to do that anymore. You can do a web development project. So you can use MVC, for example, or even now you can use Visual Studio Code, which Microsoft released a while back, which is really cool. They're really proactive with developing new open source stuff as well. So they've created the Yo Office, which is a Yeoman generator for generating the project structure for you, like the boilerplate for your project. So you can create Office add-ins just by typing Yo Office. It will create all the projects for you, and then you just have to add your logic to it. And I've seen people build or started to build the same thing for Office 365 SharePoint add-ins, and being able to do that with that object model as well, using a generator. So if you're on a Macintosh and you want to code create a new project, you can do that using Visual Studio Code, which now works cross-platform. So you can use that from your Macintosh or OS X. You can launch it, you can type Yo Office, and you have a new Office add-in. You can just start developing. So there's no requirement on using Visual Studio on a Windows machine and create a SharePoint project. You just create a decoupled project, for example, just a normal web development project of any kind.
Starting with development, do you have some recommendations where people can find guidance, information, best practice?
Yeah, my single source of guidance is an open source project, which most of Microsoft is promoting very well. It's the Office 365 Patterns and Practices. They call it the PNP for Patterns and Practices. You can find that on GitHub, and there's a lot of documentation, a lot of guidance on how you can actually use SharePoint. Where do I get started? How do I provision sites with the object model? Where do I do this? Where do I do that? And it's a great guidance for people to use that. So I would say that is my single source that I recommend people. And then second, after that, I would say get to know people in the community. The SharePoint community is getting wider and broader. It's not really just a SharePoint community, because I'm part of web development communities, I'm part of Office 365 groups, I'm part of SharePoint groups, so it's a wide range of groups. So it's not just about the SharePoint community anymore, it's more about being a web developer and get to know the people that develop for the Office 365 APIs, which you will find in the SharePoint community a lot. If you get to know them, follow them on Twitter, interact with them on Twitter, because most people are really, really open to interactions. And if you start typing a message to them on Twitter or on Facebook or wherever you find them, you're most likely going to realize that you also get a reply and you can start a discussion. So if you have a question, just, for example, drop me a message on Twitter or mention me on Twitter and ask for something, and I'll give you a reply on Twitter if I have the time.
What's your Twitter handle?
It's my last name, @Zimmergren. Yeah. So yeah. It's easy enough. Okay.
Tobias, thank you very much for the insights and have a great time here at the European SharePoint Conference.